about to
And
go
here,
live. Yes.
what we are, believe it or not, we are live. Hi, Garland Nixon, and I'm here with Joti Brar. She's putting a link in her Telegram channel, and that's very important. Let's talk. Hello. Yeah. We have Scott Ritter and Andre Martianov and the rest of those guys. But today we're going to get down to business. We've got the one and only Joti Brar. Joti, we're going to talk about very important things. Make sure you share this on all of your social media platforms. I always learn a lot. I always have a really great time. And I think our discussions are very organic. And as an example, the last time we talked, one of the things that Joti said that I thought was important, that stuck with me, right? And I think this is good because a lot of people have anxiety about, oh my gosh, the system's coming apart, the system's crashing. Oh, what's going to happen? Are we all going to, be wandering the street like some kind of a zombie apocalypse? And what Joti said was this, inspiring. Be wary, I'm paraphrasing, of being anxious over the system crashing, because that may inspire you to try to cling on to this terrible system, and it needs to be replaced with something better. And I thought, wow, that's very inspiring. So I thought, let's talk about, to understand why this system is crashing and the potential for a better system, people need to understand what it is about the imperialist system, of this system of imperialism, of what I would consider, some people call it fascism. I've heard the term Vijay Prashad recently has been talking about hyper-imperialism. Let's talk about, and Lenin, a lot of people have talked about this, why it is that this system, everybody can look at it now and say, well, the ruling elite, they don't even listen to us anymore. They don't even try to pretend like, they don't even try to fool us into thinking that they're protecting us anymore. There's no more, we're saving you from terrorism. Literally, they're just like, yeah, we want to maintain hegemony and we don't even care who knows anymore. It's over. Why is it, Joti Brar, that the system that we have, this Western imperialist system, is crashing so precipitously?
That's a good question. It's a big question. The root of the answer is simply that the contradictions which make capitalism unworkable are at the core of the way that capitalism produces wealth. So every society produces, right back to the birth of humanity, you have to produce things in order to survive. The very earliest humans, of course, were hunter-gatherers, and most of what they got, I guess, before they were hunters, they were simply gatherers and scavengers, right? But in the process of becoming human was the process of learning to produce. So the first things people produced were tools for hunting animals, so you could get a different type of food source. There were tools for carrying things, so that you could gather and take things from the point of gathering to somewhere else. Right, and so humanity's whole development is bound up with production, and we produce collectively as a society, and at different levels of the development of our society, we produce in different ways, different levels of technology, and harnessing the power of society in different ways. So the capitalist system is the system in which most production is done for profit. What that means is the only incentive for somebody to get engaged in the job of producing things that society needs is to make some money turn into more money. And without the assurance that that is what's going to happen out of your production, the producer won't get involved. And, for historical reasons, we've ended up in a situation, and this is something that capitalism also needs, where the mass of the people have no ability to keep themselves alive, apart from by working for somebody who has those means. So, in former types of society, and particularly, in primitive societies, we shared collectively in groups, we shared the means of production and subsistence. We might have made tools individually, but we did the hunting together and we brought back the hunt and shared it with everybody. We did the collecting collectively, we did other jobs collectively, and we shared what we had produced, and we could see that direct relationship and our dependence on one another. Over the, millennia of human civilization and the division of society into classes and the increasing division of labor, the specialization of humans to do one tiny bit of society's big work, whereby everybody doesn't know how to do everything anymore. Most of us know how to do a very tiny, very specialized thing that's part of this very big system of producing everything at a much higher technical level. And so we have this historically evolved system. So it's a very incomplete explanation because I'm trying to cut it down and, so sorry for all the things I'm not saying, right? But we have this historically evolved situation where the masses of the people have been separated from the ability to feed, clothe, and house themselves. They have to sell themselves to the people who have the capital, the means of production in their hands. And the capitalist, therefore, is an owner of capital, someone who can put wage workers to work in such a way they will make money for him, right? Which means using his means of production to create wealth. So there's this kind of separation between the two. But what if you're producing, so we have the situation where the modern machinery, modern factories, modern means of production have become so incredibly productive that as a society, as a species, as a whole, humanity can now provide for itself a good and constantly rising standard of living whilst working actually very little. That's the truth. That's the rational ability that we've created. But that's not how production for profit works. The problem is that these huge means of production under capitalism can only be moved, can only be put into motion if the end result is going to be that the person who owns that means of production will end up that his pile of money got bigger. And as soon as you do that, you're creating this situation where in order to make the profit, which is the motivation for the capitalist, what you have to do is steal the value produced by a worker, so that the value you give the worker as their wages is not the same as the value that the worker produces while working. So there's a mismatch. So wealth is being created when the worker works, right? Now, some of that wealth goes back to the worker so he can stay alive, but by no means all of it. And the more productive that modern machinery becomes, as a proportion of the wealth that worker is producing each day, the proportion of which goes to him for his wages actually gets smaller and smaller. So you have this situation where productive labor, i.e. work that works on some means of production and creates more wealth, that work is creating wealth that goes to somebody else. But there's more than just a kind of unfairness problem here. There's actually a problem that in the process of production, what's happening? The worker is producing lots of goods. Now, those goods have to be bought in order for the profit of the capitalist to be realized. All well and good. There's lots of people out there who will like to buy things. The problem is, on the one hand, the individual capitalist, in order to get ahead of the competition, he has and to maximize his profits, two things he wants to do is increase mechanization, so that there's fewer people he has to pay and productivity goes up and he can kind of get ahead in the battle of competition against his rivals. And the other one is that he wants to force down the wages of his workers because then he'll get more profit. If he's paying them less, his profits are bigger. And there's an exact relationship between levels of wages and levels of profitability, right? They're inversely proportionate because wealth is created and however much goes in wages, that's however much is not going in profit. So the capitalist wants to have fewer workers and push down their wages, but he also wants to sell all the stuff he's been producing. And there's a mismatch there, which is built into the system of capitalism. The very fact of producing for profit and amassing wealth out of the hands of the producers means that those producers, who are also the market, the workers, can't buy back the products they produced. And so you have this problem, which is called the crisis of overproduction. Huge amount being produced, it can't be sold because the people who should be buying it are too poor. Yeah. And that is, as soon as you have any production for profit, that problem is building up in your economy. Marx and Engels pointed out that ever since, I think it was 1820 or 23, something like that, the first big overproduction crisis fully matured in Britain. And ever since then, there have been regular boom and bust crashes in a capitalist economy that you cannot escape from. Now, the era of imperialism was one way where the advanced capitalist powers tried to escape their crisis by exporting, expanding their markets, exporting their goods to the world, expanding markets that they had control over, so they could, for a while, you know, you can keep growing, right? Because there's places to export to. But for more than 100 years now, we've had a problem where the capitalist system is global. Or the whole of the world's markets are part of this system, apart from countries which break out because of socialism, right? The whole of the global market now has the same problem of overproduction, except where can you export to? So the crisis is deeper and more inescapable, and it leads to war. It leads to contradictions and fights amongst imperialists, which is what we saw in World War I and World War II. And it leads to what we see today, which is, you know, the remnants of the, you know, imperialist powers sticking together to try to stop independent countries from rising and excluding them from control of their markets, to try to recolonize and reconquest every part of the world that has become in any way sovereign. You know, if you look back to I think I've talked to you a bit about this before, but if you look back to when the Soviet Union fell to counter-revolution in 1991, you see how a global economic crisis for the imperialists, for the capitalist class, was basically kind of solved by the bonanza the imperialists had in looting the wealth of the Soviet Union and of the Eastern European bloc. And they essentially recolonized those countries. They turned them from advanced, socialist, independent, sovereign countries into colonies. And the thing that they hate Vladimir Putin for, President Putin, is he has been the figurehead of Russia realizing it didn't have to be a colony, because it had all the wherewithal not to be one. And they said, why do we have to be a colony? We're not going to be a colony. We've got weapons. We can stand up to you, you know. And because of that legacy of the Soviet Union, despite having lost their socialism, they started to push back and to rebuild their ability to be truly sovereign. And of course, it's a thing they won't forgive him for. But to get back to the root of your question, why is the system crashing? Right now, we can see the global capitalist crisis of overproduction has reached a tremendous level. It's the worst it's ever been, right? And this is the same kind of crisis that drove the world into World War I, that drove it into World War II, which drove the Great Depression. Right now, the state of the overproduction crisis is such that if we look closely at the economy of any of the imperialist countries, we see they're mired in debt. We see that they are essentially bankrupt. We see they're all printing money and exporting their inflation, which of course imperialist countries can do for a certain amount of time. They're all trying to export their inflation and keep the economy looking like it's working when it really isn't. And they're driving ever faster. They're desperately driving into war, because literally right now, the only thing that's going to save them temporarily, let's all bear this in mind too, if you're siding with the stabilization plot of the imperialists, understand that it's temporary. Look at World War I, look at World War II, look at the price that humanity paid for the system to stabilize itself and how long it stayed stable for, right? It's not a bargain you want to be part of, frankly. World War I, you know, what, 100 million people killed, huge amount of Europe laid waste. the men of not only Europe, but actually from all around the empire, sucked into these killing fields in Flanders and, across France and Belgium. And within 10 years, the world was enmeshed in another overproduction crisis that had bankers in Wall Street jumping out of windows, and that was just the beginning of what was going on. It led to fascism. It led to this, the titanic battles of World War II were about, fundamentally the imperialist system trying to stabilize itself, and particularly trying to, in that difficult situation, trying to wipe out communism. It was really, the big fight was between imperialism and communism in World War II. Imperialism, as fascism, but fascism is just imperialism trying to save itself, essentially. And now again we have this situation. So we've talked before about how the fall of the USSR was a massive defeat for people all over the world, and it was a big defeat, and a big period of retreat followed that. And the Americans came in saying, right, this is our moment. This is the new American century. We're going to stomp all over everybody. We have got a shot in the arm from looting the Soviet Union. Morally, we make a big fanfare that capitalism is the end of human history, and that's that. And and the people of the world went, oh, we've just got to put up with this. But the boom period for the imperialists didn't last that long. It's well and truly over. Their system is totally enmeshed in crisis again. The only way they can see out is war. But the people of the world don't just sit there and take it all. Increasingly, people around the world are saying, up with this, we will not put, right? And this is the situation in which we now have to ask ourselves, number one, are you up for helping the imperialists restabilize a system which costs humanity so much in blood and treasure all the time, which will only impoverish you as a worker? There's no point identifying with the billionaires. You're not one. You're not going to be one. You're just going to get poorer. And in the process of trying to restabilize, you're going to facilitate the spread of the most horrific anti-human practices and ideologies, the proliferation of fascist ideologies around the world is a sign of the imperialists trying to drum up armies for itself, because its home people are not very motivated to fight for imperialism. So they make proxy armies who they motivate with these horrific fascist ideologies. So you've got fascists in Ukraine, fascists in Israel, fascists of the ISIS type. Everywhere you look, imperialism is creating fascistic proxy armies as its kind of foot soldiers. The question is, as things get more difficult for imperialism, it's going to want us to be its foot soldiers too. And we've got to ask ourselves: are we up for helping the devil to regain his control of this world, or do we want to join the oppressed in pushing the whole system into the dustbin of history? Because that's the fight that's coming before us now.
Interesting. Let me ask you about this. We're in an interesting situation now in that before I go into the second part, this could be two parts, so let's start here. The imperialists felt that, okay, the USSR is done, and so we're done with that, and now our next move is to pick the bones of the USSR. Clearly they want to get all these natural resources. They want to take all of the things that are present in the Russian Eurasian zone, right? They see it as an economic zone because they see everything as an economic zone. Okay. But it appears that the anti-imperialist spirit, in other words, USSR is dead, but it isn't. You know what I mean? You know where I'm going with this? Go ahead, take it from there. They thought they killed it, but they didn't. It's almost, let me say this. You know what? You watch these movies, right? The scary movies, and the crazy person is trying. Thought they killed it, but they didn't. It's almost, let me say this. You know what? You watch these movies, right? The scary movies, and the crazy person is trying to kill everyone in the family, and they bop them in the head with an old bowling trophy or something, and the guy falls behind a couch, and they're like, yay, they got the bad guy. Instead of running out of the house, they hug, oh, oh, happy we, but the dead guy's not really dead. And they're like looking the other way, and you see his head peeping up over the couch, and he goes to grab him again, right? That's the USSR. They thought they had hit it in the head with a bowling trophy. They're over here celebrating, and Vladimir Putin's peeking up over the couch again, saying, haha, you thought I was gone, but we're not gone. Anyway, that's a weird metaphor, but go ahead with it. Make some sense out of it. How's that?
From the perspective of the imperialists, you can use that metaphor. They see the USSR, they see the collective power of the masses as an evil monster. Of course, it isn't. They're the evil monster, right? They have a problem with their projection, and everything is back to front in all their propaganda. They are the ones who are evil and anti-human, and not the masses. Now, one thing that they teach us, because of their warped view of the world and of humanity, and that we have to fight back against, is that there's something wrong with people. But we have to have faith in people, in the working class, in their abilities, in their creativity, in the potential for them to organize themselves for the better, in the potential for them to build a new society and be the leaders of that society, right? And just remember, when you're being encouraged to feel pessimistic about humanity, you are one. Are you? Ask yourself the things they tell you about humans, and they encourage you that it's everybody else, isn't it? But ask yourself, are you happy to be greedy, to be selfish, do you go through life saying, fuck everybody else, I'm just here for me, number one rules, and forget the rest of the world? And if you do, are you happy with yourself, right? I mean, you know, the imperialists, the capitalists, they create a vision of humanity which is a reflection of their system, and they try to make us believe in that vision. But it's not a true vision of humanity. It's not human nature they're reflecting the nature of their system. And they, as the embodifications, the embodiments of their capital, are of course much more likely to fit the stereotypes they're trying to scare us with. You know, that's the sad Faustian position they find themselves in, right? But you know, you're right. The USSR is unkillable. Why? You know, my father, who you've spoke to a few times, you know, he likes to say, if Marxism is really dead, why do they have to keep killing it every day? Like something that's really dead, like you stop talking about it, like you stop thinking about it. But Marxism is one of these things that, you know, they tell you, they declare to you it's dead, and then the next day they have to declare it again, and the next day and the day after that. So actually, the truth is Marxism is scientific socialism, and you can no more kill scientific socialism than you can kill the modern working class. It is the modern working class's historical role that it will be the builder of the new society. It's capitalism that's brought both modern means of production and the modern working class into being. It's the job of the modern working class to take those means of production into a new type of society that will unleash their power for the good of humanity, for the benefit of all. And we can actually live in the high-tech future paradise that we sort of think is something that you just get in science fiction, right? That it is possible to rediscover our humanity on a higher technological plane by putting together the modern working class and modern means of production in a planned way, an organized way, taking away the ghost in the machine of capitalism, the glitch that keeps coming back, which is production for profit. Production for profit messes with everything, creates these huge inequalities that we were talking about earlier, and all of the problems that end up in crisis and war and everything that's heinous that we look at the world in the world today. When you get right to the root of it, you will find that it's production for profit. It's the production of everything as a commodity, which has destroyed our ability to apply human logic to anything. And we need to change the system in order to be able to apply human logic. One of the mistakes too many people make is they try to appeal to the leaders of the capitalist system, the directors of the capitalist system, using human logic. And the problem is they're not capable of responding to human logic because the system has its own logic. And if you're running capitalism, you have to think in capitalist logic. And if you don't think in capitalist logic, you won't be running capitalism, right? So in order to do that job, you have to think on behalf of capital, what capital needs, what capital forces you to do, extend the working day, increase exploitation, you know, amass more money into bigger piles, even though it's going to mess with that entire world's stability, right? That's just the logic of the system. You know, I've got to make a profit in the next quarter. And that's ultimately the only thing that matters, right? So, you know, there's an interesting thing about, you know, the USSR. So number one, there's the fact that, you know, it was based on scientific socialism. And of course, you can't kill scientific socialism. It's our path to the future. And it's going to be here for as long as there's people. But with the USSR specifically, you know, you said something interesting while you were introducing the first question, which was, you know, they don't even bother pretending now that they're still listening to us. But if we look back in history, the capitalists didn't always pretend to be listening to the workers. They didn't feel the need to pretend that the opinions of the poorest had any value or validation. They were quite happy to say, well, these are uneducated idiots, like, they don't know what's good for them. We know what's good for them. We have education. They don't. And it's natural that they don't, because they're uneducable. I mean, there was generally, you know, capitalists 200 years ago would say quite openly and agree with each other that the masses are uneducable. You know, they're just a lumpen, you know, blob who just have to, you know their place because that's all they're fit for. What is it that changed that? Look again and you will see it's the USSR. So many of the things that we have been taught in our generations, the post-war generations, where Western Europe and the USA were rebuilt in such a way that a portion of the imperialist loot was redistributed to lift up the lives of even the poorest in those countries. And we came to see that as what Western life is like. Right? That it's automatic that if you live in one of those countries, you'll have a job and a home and security and a nice, comfortable way of life and a decent, civilized existence. And you'll look down on people in the rest of the world and say, they're not like us, are they? People have forgotten that when those concessions were made, it was because of the balance of class forces, both inside their countries, but crucially, internationally. And the demand for those things had come from seeing the huge gains made in the Soviet Union between the wars, when everyone else was suffering the Great Depression and the Soviet Union's economy was growing exponentially, and the standard of living of its people was going from, you know, incredibly low to amazingly civilized in such a short amount of time, while everybody else was in the dirt. You know yourself from the stories of Steinbeck and things, what the Great Depression was like in the USA. You know, we have the same, you know, the Jarrow hunger marches in Britain, you know, the state of the poor during the 20s and 30s in Western Europe, in the rich countries, in the imperialist countries that looted the world. During that overproduction crisis, the state of life for the poor people was absolutely unbearable. And they, as a result of experiencing that in those rich countries, whilst watching the Soviet Union go from strength to strength, by the end of the war, when the Soviet Union had smashed the Nazis, the communist resistance had led all the partisans in Europe. You know, at the end of that period, the demand for communism, the demand for what socialism can bring to workers was so high that without granting concessions along those lines, imperialism in Europe was gone. USA stepped in and helped, but there was essentially a peace deal made. And so when we look at the life that we are now seeing being unpicked by a ruling class which is in crisis again, which doesn't have the USSR hanging over it, and which wants to pass on the burden of the crisis to the backs of the poor, as it always does, we are trying to defend a life that we have been brought up to consider to be the civilized values of the West, when in fact, they are the civilized values of the USSR. It's the USSR that gave me the NHS, right? It's the USSR that gave me free schooling and free violin lessons as a little kid. It wasn't the philanthropic desire of the owners of British finance capital to make sure that every working class bod, could have a decent existence in the, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. It was pressure of the class struggle and the balance of class forces. What we have to learn from all of that, number one, is to understand the values that we cherish and everything civilized about life that we cherish has come to us because of class struggle and because of socialism. And that while we allow the system of capitalist imperialism to continue, every time we gain something, without pushing on to gain everything, we are just simply granting our enemies, our class enemies, the opportunity to regroup and come back and take it away again. So the best you can do under capitalism is to endlessly fight the same battles. And, if you fight really hard, you'll go backwards a bit more slowly.
Right. One of the things that I've argued with the so-called left in the U.S., right? They call themselves the democratic socialist, whatever the case may be, right? Or some don't call themselves anything; they call themselves the left. And what they say, to me, it's basically this: there's a big pie, and the military-industrials, they're going to get theirs. The bankers are going to get theirs. We just want to make sure that the people get an adequate enough of the pie that we are okay. So yeah, we'll be okay. We're going to live within this system. And they somehow fool themselves into thinking that at some point the ruling elite will say, well, in order to survive, we got to be fair. So we'll give you health care, we'll give you this, we'll give you that. And so we'll take, bottom line, it's like at some point, like there's a percentage point, like, okay, we'll be happy if the ruling elite takes 70%. And the other 30%, they can distribute amongst the other 99.9%. 0.01%, they get 70% of everything. And if we can just get 30% to distribute amongst everyone else, and we'll have kind of decent education, not as good as we really deserve, and that will take. But the other part of it is inherently, there's something in that argument. And the problem I have, this is what I say, the problem I have with that argument is this, and I always put it like this: you want a piece of the pie, but you don't want to have the discussion about what's in that pie. Because to have the discussion that I'm going to stabilize my system in the US enough that the working class can survive, that they're not miserable. But what about the guy in Bolivia who's being worked to death in a mine so that we can build that pie? What about the countries and the people around the world that we are oppressing to bake the pie? I'm going to ignore how the pie is baked and just say, as long as I get a fair a piece of the pie, not even a fair piece, enough that I can say I'm not miserable, I'm doing okay. I'll ignore the origin of the pie, and I will ignore still the unfairness in the system that 99% of the people only get 30% of the profits and the things that they create. Anyway, your thoughts on that?
You've summed it up, Garland, actually really, really well. As soon as you're talking about our share of the imperialist pie, you are allowing yourself to become complicit. You're saying, give me a bribe and I will facilitate your crimes. I'll turn a blind eye to your crimes. It's all right with me. And that is how the peoples of Western Europe and the USA have lived. It is demoralizing. It is dehumanizing, actually. You can sit around feeling superior because your standard of life is better. You can put your blinkers on and pretend that you haven't understood that your wealth is connected to the poverty of others. But it is increasingly obvious to people that that is the relationship, right? And so the question of what is the pie and how was it baked is the kind of crucial one for humanity. But here's another thing. If you actually allowed yourself to be part of the movement for socialism and were victorious, the thing about the pie under socialism is there's no crises. crisis is gone. And so our pie might start like this. It might even shrink a bit because of the problems of war and revolution. But then, as we apply our energies to planned production, our pie, the pie that will then be able to be divided equally, or, you know, with egalitarian principles, right, to all the people of the world, it's going to grow and grow. There's no limits, actually, to the growth of human wealth when you don't have capitalism, right? The limits are what we need, what we want to produce things for, you know, but actually there's not even limits to what the earth can provide, because it's like, for example, you know, what you put a bit of serious effort into, I get them muddled up, nuclear fusion technology, and I'm sure that, you know, within a decade or two, you'd have basically free limitless energy, and you wouldn't be like, oh no, but we're running out of sources of energy, or, you know, all these arguments. You know, technology makes them redundant. What the earth can produce depends on your technological abilities. So, you know, the idea that there are limits to what humanity can provide for itself, I think, is fundamentally wrong, and it's based on the capitalist model and not understanding that the socialist model is something entirely different. So there's that aspect, right? Why settle for a pie where, you know, wealth grows, but the proportion of wealth that comes to the masses gets smaller as the pie grows, not bigger. And every so often, because of that very problem, the capitalists have to destroy a whole bunch of the pie and a whole bunch of you in order to have a pie at all and start the whole process again, right? So you know, if you actually stop and look at it, you know, there's no contest. I want a little bit of the socialist pie, please, and my bit's going to keep growing, and it won't be at anybody's expense. You know, it will be purely on the basis of putting the technology we have produced at the service of the people instead of the service of profit. But you put your finger on something really important, which is you've pinpointed the social democratic formula. Social democracy was identified by Lenin during World War I. He was trying to understand why it was that the socialist parties, which in all the period leading up to World War I had all been saying there's a war coming, and when it comes, we must make sure that the workers refuse to fight one another in the interests of the capitalists. They must turn their guns on the rulers, make socialist revolution, and, you know, we'll have a happy future. Only the Bolsheviks did that. They carried out that program. They said, workers, it's not our job to fight other workers. What we need to do is turn our guns on our exploiters and make socialism. And, you know, fundamentally, that was the big message. And they succeeded in carrying that out. That's what the Bolshevik Revolution was, in the October Revolution in 1917. That was the foundation of what became the Soviet Union and the world's first and humongously successful, don't let anybody tell you different, socialist state. The social democratic formula that Lenin uncovered was a small section of the working class had been co-opted, and that included its leadership, had been co-opted by the imperialists because they are bringing in so much wealth. They can pay, they can bribe this section of the working class into acquiescence, into feeling that they have privileges, and those privileges are tied to the continuation of the system, right? And so you give people a sense of superiority, a slightly nicer life, better conditions. You tie them to the system. You make them loyal servants of the system, and then they do the job of misleading the rest of the working class for you. And their job is to prettify imperialist exploitation, to make to head up the demand for fairer, nicer, kinder capitalist imperialism, you know, and to essentially keep the working class demand for socialism under control. And what they've really done, we've seen certainly since World War II, they have changed the definition of socialism. It used to mean a revolutionary transformation of society. So we have a new system of economic production, the planned economic system, socialism. Instead, now what they've made it mean is capitalism, imperialism with kinder characteristics, with a little bit more of the pie coming to ordinary people, but the system itself remains intact. And of course, the system is the root of all of the problems. So, yeah, did I answer your question?
Yes, very much. You know, what's interesting is the ruling elite understands very much that the revolutionary spirit, the anti-imperialist spirit of the Soviet Union, a period, ever can't isn't dead, can't be killed, because one of the things that they will admit oftentimes, you know, and when they're not thinking about it, when it comes to Hamas, some of them will say it. They'll say, well, the Israelis say they're going to destroy Hamas, and they'll say, you can't destroy Hamas. It's a thinking, it's a way of believing. And they'll even, some of them will even admit, well, you know, the more you kill people, the more they will want to push back. Their kids will be upset. The more they'll fight back. You're creating more. They will admit it. In fact, Donald Rumsfeld once said, you know, the more terrorists we kill, the more we create, right? Which says, if you translate that to economics, which are inextricably linked, their violence and economics, what they're saying is this: the more we oppress the working class, the more we create a revolutionary spirit amongst the working class. The more we kill and maim and mistreat the Palestinians, the more of them are going to want to fight back. And they'll say they've got nothing to lose, they're suffering. That applies exactly, and they know it, because they're saying it about Hamas. They understand the more we oppress the working class, the more we're going to build a revolutionary spirit.
100%. And, you know, both internationally and on the national scene, we see the same story repeated again and again. You know, you can't destroy Hamas. Oppression breeds resistance. That's a fundamental law of history. The more you push down on people, the more you are building up the force that's going to push back. And we've seen again and again and again in the history of the 20th century. And again, there's a big legacy of October here, because in the 19th century, when the colonial powers were so militarily and economically and technologically dominant, they were able to push people around almost with impunity, because those people had so little with which they didn't know what these people were who came from abroad with this weird technologies, and they just had no mechanism for defending themselves and pushing back. And so, you know, all sorts of things were done to them that they were sort of, you know, forced to be victims of in many situations. Many huge populations moved, you know, wiped out, and the resistance came, but it wasn't able to be effectual because it didn't have a level of technology or organization that enabled it, facilitated it to really fight back against these seemingly overwhelming powers. But people learn. And this is something the imperialists are not really capable of learning. They have a mindset that says we are superior. And they haven't understood that since October, their system has been the dying system. Their system is the one that's being replaced, and their class is the class of the past. Their attempts to cling on to power are attempts to hold back the wheel of history, and they will only last for so long. They can cause mayhem and genocide in the process, but ultimately they're going to fail. They're on the way out because their system, its future is in the past. Everything it had to offer to humanity, we have got, and everything now that can be done with modern technology and modern means of production needs socialism to unleash that power, right? But oppression breeds resistance, and we've seen that, you know, since October, not only gave that incredible impetus to the minds of people all over the world that there's no such thing as a superior human being. I have as much dignity as, you know, that finance capitalist in London who comes and lords it over me, the Queen Empress, or, you know, whoever, the president of the USA. I also am a human being, right? And I have a right to an existence and a decent existence. And I have a right to not live in the dirt as a servant and a slave of these imperialists. And ever since October, showed people the way to liberation, showed that racism didn't have any justifications, showed that oppression of women didn't have any real justifications, then what we've had is a mentality of people in the world that can't be reversed now. That nobody believes in the intrinsic superiority of Americans or Europeans, and as a result, there's only so much you can do to keep people down. The national liberation consciousness that was spread over the globe from October onwards and really took very deep roots after World War II can't be got rid of. There's only so long you can, like I said, push down on people before they just organize themselves to fight back. And what we also saw, Chairman Mao pointed it out, but we saw it in Korea, we saw it in Vietnam, is that even people who are poor and technologically backward, if they are motivated and organized, they will win, even against these huge powers, and the truth is that against an organized and motivated enemy, the USA hasn't won a war since World War II. It has had some victories for sure, but if you look at the real wars it's engaged in, where people were organized and motivated to fight back, they caused immense bloodshed. The death tolls in those wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, horrific. They don't win. So you can't keep the people down. And that comes back, then you were saying about, at home as well with the workers. Well, this has been known to socialists since there was such a thing as scientific socialism. In the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, when Marx and Engels were like 28 and 30, they were young men when they wrote that, when Europe was undergoing a revolutionary surge. They wrote in the Communist Manifesto, what the capitalist system creates above all else is its own grave diggers. By producing the working class, it is producing the people who are going to destroy the system, who have nothing to lose and everything to gain by overthrowing the system. And it's exactly the same on the international scale, by oppressing nationalities, by looting them so ruthlessly. They are creating the drive to get organized, to throw off the shackles of this oppression. And these are two sides of the same fight. And this is one of the things that's so important when you live in the West to understand, is that imperialism looks like it's really strong, but a lot of its strength comes from the fact that it's looting wealth from elsewhere in the world. So for us, every time a colony kicks the empire out, we should be really happy. We should be working to see how we can help those struggles. Practically, how can we help them? Because every struggle abroad that's successful is making our own enemy at home weaker, right? So it's practically a blow for us, right? We've got to get out of the way of thinking of identifying that our interests are with the stability of the system, and that if the Africans are kicking the imperialists out and the imperialists are poorer, that's going to be bad for us. Oh dear, well we need the system to be stable. We don't want the imperialists to be getting poor and worried and having to push down on us at home. No, again, do we want to keep this system that rapes and pillages and destroys and is incapable of solving simple problems? Do we want to keep that going, out of a kind of fear of the future, a fear that's been instilled in us by the very people who are pushing us into the dirt, right? Or do we want to recognize that together, if we fight in a joint way with the people of the oppressed world, we can get rid of the monster that's on all of our backs and go into a, so much saner, healthier, humane future?
One of the things, I might have, stop me if you've heard this before, but it's interesting. I studied a lot about slavery and what was going on in our society during slavery, particularly what led up to the Civil War. And one of the interesting things was the book wars, right? Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which painted a very negative picture of slavery, right? Okay, the ruling elite in the South, they were not happy about that. That was a turning point. Okay, they didn't want to be exposed. So that sparked a number of oppositional books, because it was like, what they said is, well, our slaves are, they're childlike. They use that term often. They're childlike. They can't. We're looking out for them. We're feeding them. Then we beat them and rape them and stuff every now and then. Sure, but hey, we're not perfect. We're fallen human. They literally use that. We're fallen human beings, and we're working to be more like Christians, but we make errors occasionally. But we're looking out for our slaves. We put a roof over their head. We give them food. They're childlike. We take care of them. Now, a book was written called The Northern Planter's Bride, which was like really one of the first Western attacks on capitalism. It was a pretty bad book, but it wasn't a quality book. But it made the argument for the Northerners. Hey, look what you're doing. You say we're treating our slaves bad. You've got white people you have there. You're bringing in from other countries, and you've got them working in these dangerous mills, working all kinds of out, and they went on about all the terrible things that the Industrial Revolution was doing. So what you had was an argument amongst the ruling elite saying, yeah, we treat our people bad, but you have no room to talk. You treat your people bad. And they were really both exposing the ills of the capitalist class, that they were arguing over who mistreated their people the worst. But I think, to be quite frank, the slave owning class was more honest about it, at least. Because they were saying, we have nothing but contempt for these people. They're our lessers, blah, blah, blah. And that's why we're doing it. Wherein the capitalist class in the North, the industrial titans, tried to pretend as though that they're white and we're white. We're all looking out for each other. They're going to do okay. We're providing. The slave owning class didn't even pretend that. Anyway, your thoughts on that argument, on what I personally consider one of the first really cogent attacks on capitalism that happen to come from ironically come from the capitalist class in the West.
There's interesting parallels in Britain. One thing you've noticed, and we see it again and again and again, that the capitalists, whatever they're arguing for, will try to dress up their self-interest as care for humanity. And one of the reasons for that is because actually, since the outset, since the very beginnings of the capitalist system, in order to fight their battles against the feudal class, and then in order to fight their sectional battles amongst themselves, the capitalists have been mobilizing the working masses into political life and political action. Now, that is a very double-edged sword. So they need to motivate the masses. They need to bring them into these political debates. They need foot soldiers to fight one another. But having done that, you woke the sleeping giant, right? The serfs in the days of the feudal system were never encouraged to imagine they should have a view about how the Lord was running his manor, right? Or how never mind the king or the Pope or anybody higher up, right? That's absolutely outside your realm. God put you in this bit of society, and that's where you're going to stay, and this is all there is. But in the capitalist system, the battles between rival classes and then between sections of the same class have involved the mobilization of the masses on the different sides of the argument. And in Britain, we had something very similar. It's documented in Capital by Marx. And it's really for people who just want to know some history of the working class. Capital is an amazing book because he references so many studies that were being, England was the classic country of the development, or Britain, of the development of industry, where, because it was the first country, then, you saw how each stage, it was the kind of classical workings out of, there was no shortcuts to anything because it hadn't happened anywhere else already. Other countries were able to look at what Britain had done and go, oh, we'll do that or we'll do that. But in Britain, it all kind of worked itself out in a very kind of organic way. And you saw the development of all of these tensions, right? But mobilizing the masses and dressing up their interest as, oh, we care about you people. It's really interesting to see that parallel. You talked about this attack on slavery coming from the industrialists, and then the slave owners responding by making an attack on capitalist exploitation. Well, we had something very similar here in Britain. We had the most horrific conditions for workers in the early stages of industrial development in Britain. I mean, it was like 100 years worth. It's not that, but they became, it got to the point where, you had very small children working sort of 15, 16-hour days. I mean, literally being worked to death. And there were problems where, the number of workers or the generations were being used up too quickly. And they were having to constantly bring in new workforce from the countryside and then from other countries to replenish, because they were using them up so fast. They were dying when they were 30, and the working conditions were so horrific, and like I say, the kids, the women, everybody was just being absorbed by these factories, made really sick, worked to death basically, and the conditions were so horrific that the Tories in Britain, who were the section of the ruling class that was kind of represented the landed bourgeois, who had previously been, kind of the feudal class. They'd become bourgeoisified, capitalist farmers, right? But they were a different kind of sectional interest than the industrialists. And they joined the attack on the industrialists, saying, the slaves in the Indies have better conditions than your workers. You claim to be against slavery, but actually you're creating a good argument for slavery the way you treat your workers, because actually, a slave owner has to take care of his slaves. You don't take care of your workers. Look what a state they're in. Lots of them don't even have a roof over their head or anything to eat or the rest of it. So the Tories were able to use the horrific conditions of working class workers in industrial towns in Britain during the early 19th century to almost as a justification for slavery, or certainly as a comparison where they said, or a comparator where they said, actually slavery is better than what you're doing. And they could do that with some justice, right? That was actually, you could make a comparison in the conditions of those two. And what it really shows you is that the capitalist system, whilst it creates freedom of movement for individuals, or an apparent freedom from slavery and from serfdom, the reality is it is a system of wage slavery. The capitalist class has enslaved the masses. We, as the working class, are enslaved to the capitalist class as a group, as a collective. We don't have individual bonds of slavery, but collectively we are enslaved. What choice do we have about whether to sell ourselves for wages or not? Do you have some other way to maintain yourself other than by, selling yourself to somebody for wages? Of course you don't. So, that collectively we are enslaved, and that's why the wages system, which is another name for capitalism, is also called wage slavery. To understand this is something really important. Fundamentally, the mechanisms for the enslavement of the workers during the different phases of class society, from slavery to feudalism to capitalism, the mechanisms and the appearance of how exploitation is continued and carried on are different. But the fundamental underlying reality of one class of exploiters and the mass of exploited who must be exploited in order to live, that hasn't actually changed, and it won't change until we've got rid of capitalism.
I think what we're talking about here is this, a term I like to use, degrees along a continuum, right? So what and I think the ruling elite understand this. If we go of 1 to 10, that the 0 to 10, that the lowest degree of slavery is 0, where you are basically treated like animals, right? You're held captive, you're beaten, you're whatever, you have no rights whatsoever. You don't have the illusion of any rights. Instead of rights, I think a more appropriate word is privileges. They can't revoke rights. Privileges are routinely revoked by the ruling elite. And then the next person along this continuum of slavery is at a 3. right? And maybe that person works in the factory town in the 1870s where they work, you know, when their kids work and everybody works. And at the end of the month, they actually owe money back to the corporation for their rent, blah, 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 right? And then you get to a point where someone has the total illusion of freedom, though they do have to work for this factory, otherwise they don't have healthcare coverage or this or that or none of these other things. So the illusion of freedom, I think it's like zero, there's no illusion of privilege or freedom or anything. And maybe as you get to 5, the illusions of freedom and privilege start to blossom to up to 10, where you have the complete illusion of freedom. And now I think you get to a point where a person who is at a 10, who totally has the illusion of freedom, is now being completely bribed by the system to control the people who are at 1 through 9. You know what I mean? So when you get to a certain point in this working exploited class, you get to a point where you believe that you are one of the ruling elite, or you're willing to accept that you're not one of them because you have greater privileges than the people below you. At any rate, does this make any sense?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, Garland, what you're talking about. And really what you're describing when you're going up your little continuum there is the gilding on the cage, right? Are there cushions on the floor of your cage? Is your cage golden instead of, you know, iron? But a cage is a cage. Is it a bigger cage? You can fly around. Maybe you can flap your wings. Maybe your wings aren't clipped anymore. You know, maybe it's like an aviary. Oh, how lovely. You know, but it's not nature, is it? You're in the cage. You're in the cage. And you know, all sorts of mechanisms people find to tell themselves they're not, you know, and all sorts of mechanisms are created to tell them they're not. You know, you go to university and you read The Guardian and you'll be incessantly told how you're a free thinker. And so we all stand there and go, I'm a free thinker. You can't brainwash me, I'm a free thinker. You can't, you know, and these are some of the hardest people to talk to, the ones who've had the most education. Now, why is that? Why is it, Garland, that it's so difficult to convince somebody who's had an education that they have been brainwashed? Because part of the brainwashing was this: I don't fall for brainwashing. I'm too clever for that stuff. And literally, like, that's one of the most important bits of brainwashing you get at university. Oh, I can't be brainwashed because I'm clever. Oh yeah, okay. And it makes them really resilient to a sensible conversation. Whereas you talk to an ordinary working class person who hasn't been to university and has been working since they were 16, and you say, you know how you've lied to about everything. You've been lied to about socialism as well. And they go, yeah, I know I'm lied to about loads of things. Yeah, you're probably right about that. Yeah. You know, they don't feel their egos threatened by you telling them they've been lied to. And so you can start a conversation. Now, part of the special privileges that some types of knowledge worker get relies on them feeling like they're special people as individuals, and therefore to feel that they're not as clever and special as they thought they were, to feel that they've been suckered in by lies is kind of undercuts the basis on which they justify that, you know, they're in the position, oh, I get paid more because I'm cleverer, because I'm, you know, just more useful, I'm just better at things, you know, not that I just happen to be born into a section of society where those options were available to me, but I'm just cleverer, right? And that seems to be true to those people because they've had access to better educations, right? So they're more articulate and they're more cultured, and they mix with other articulate, cultured people, and they look at the, you know, the mass of the plebs and go, oh, these people are just, you know, you can't teach them anything, can you? Like, well, do you know? Did you try putting those people into a school like yours? You know, but it's a comfortable assumption, isn't it? That, you know, you're in the privileged position you're in, not because of luck, you know, or being born into a certain family, but just, you know, because it's natural, cream rises to the top, and that's just how you're the cream, and that's how it is. So the people have these stories that they tell themselves to justify their privilege. But then you get, you know, when you get right to the top of your, you know, your scale, as you were talking about, you know, those functionaries of the system who really have worked out. And this is where the sociopathy that we see with the system kind of comes into play, because, of course, sociopathic behaviors under this system are rewarded. And so this system creates sociopaths. There's nothing natural about being a sociopath, but this is a system which creates them and then rewards them. And so there is a certain type of person, your kind of Blair Clinton type, who just realizes, oh, there's this opportunity now to lie and front up for the ruling class and to make a shitload of money while I do it. And, you know, if you look at the Clintons and their Clinton Foundation, you look at Blair and his Peace, whatever, you know, whatever foundations they've all got, look at the money, look at the wealth they have hoarded while fronting for the system. And you see the kind of number 10 on your scale of, you know, somebody who has just bought into, well, I can just make my cage a load better, can't I? And I don't care what I do to the others while I'm doing it, you know, forget everybody, I've made a pile of money.
One last thing, I know we're just about out of time, but one last thing, and I think it's important, and I want to get your thoughts on it. Something we've got going on now, the ruling elite have become so overtly brutal, right, that on the college campuses in the United States, and that's including the campuses of the ruling elite's children themselves, the Yale, the Columbias, et cetera, right? But all across this is spreading. The kids are protesting what's happening in Gaza. Here's a couple of interesting things, the reactions, right? We've had members of Congress say, oh, that we should call out the National Guard. We've had members of Congress, when people were protesting on the Golden Gate Bridge, members of Congress, they should be thrown over, right? Literally, a member of Congress said they should be thrown over the Golden Gate Bridge, or thrown off, right? Advocating for killing them, advocating violence against them. Your thoughts on the system getting to a point of crisis wherein the ruling elite, where they train, this is where they train these kids to run the system, to flourish in the system, to ensure that the system continues. It's gotten so out of hand that they can't even handle it anymore. And what this reflects to you.
You know, in every revolutionary period and in every great revolution, students, radical young people with a revolutionary spirit who side with the working class and the oppressed of the world, have been a really important part, an important force in the revolution. Because on the one hand, they have their education. If they're prepared to put, and they have time and they have energy and spirit, if they're prepared to put those things at the service of the oppressed, whether it's oppressed workers at home or oppressed, you know, people fighting abroad, they can really be very useful. It's the reason why Trotskyite organizations, which are basically, you know, fronts for the state, have always targeted campuses to divert the revolutionary energy of those young people away from the actual revolution and into dead ends until they grow out of it, right? Become cynical. It's the reason why identity politics has been pushed so hard through universities, why they tried to turn socialist causes of women's liberation or anti-racism into academic discourses about, you know, pain hierarchies and all of this type of nonsense that divert the natural revolutionary outrage of young people to things which are clearly wrong in society into dead ends. I think there's something really significant about the fact that the current genocide happening so publicly and unmistakably, and being so unmistakably backed and fueled by US imperialism, is cutting through all of those attempts to keep the students away from the mass struggles of the poor around the world. And the desperate repression of what are actually not that big in terms of demonstrations, the massive heavy-handedness of, you know, armed police going in to, you know, crush 19-year-olds who are, you know, they're not leading a revolution right now. They're literally having a little protest on the lawn and saying, we think genocide's a bad idea. The fact that the ruling class feels that it needs to have such a massive response to that shows how badly they're losing the media war over Gaza, and how much they fear the connection being made between the oppressed workers at home, the oppressed nations abroad, and the potentially revolutionary power of the students.
I think I have to add this. I hate to ask you for one more thing, but it should be brief. And that is, what is interesting is the weapon that they're using against the students: identity politics. The weapon that they have nothing. They've lost the narrative. So the students come out and say, "Hey, this is terrible. You're killing men, women, and children, innocent people. It's genocide." And what they say is, "This is racism. They hate the Jews." They're literally saying this. "Oh, the Jewish people are frightened to go to class and show up," right? But like half of the actual protesters in Colombia are Jewish, right? They're having like seders with their yarmulkes on and all this kind of stuff. The desperation, I just think it's desperation. They looked around for a weapon. What are we going to use? We don't have anything. Okay, we'll have to go with anti-Semitism. We got nothing. I don't know. Your thoughts on the fact that the only thing they can use, the futility of arguing identity politics in this particular instance?
What's beautiful to me about the fact that they're doing that is they are killing their own weapon. They have taken it to such absurd lengths that the people, the privileged youth who had been falling for these narratives is now having it pushed in their face to the point where it's so flipping obvious that it's a fake narrative, where the privileged get to play the bloody victim, right? And the absurdity, the obscenity of that, and the fact that you're being taken for fools when it's being done to you. Well, they have, what they're doing in the process of this is not just exposing the lie that to stand with Palestine is to be anti-Semitic. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, right? But it's exposing the whole edifice that identity politics is built on. And this, to me, is a marvelous own goal.
I think you're right. I will tell everyone the one thing I want to do, and I'd like to do, I hope we can do it the next time. Let me just share this with everyone. One of the things that I'd like to talk to Jody about, and I'd like to share with everyone, there's this thing called the Ukraine Solidarity Network, right? Stand against genocide and imperialism from Palestine to Ukraine, right? And it is the very people that we were talking about, Ukraine Solidarity Network. You can look it up. I shared it with you, Jody. And it's these people who say, we've got to stand against genocide, but we've got to stand against Russia's imperialist attack. So we'll stand against the people committing genocide in Israel, and will stand with those same genocidal people against Russia. It's very interesting. I shared that with you. Everyone out there, I'm going to put that in the comments. It's not in the comments yet. I want everybody to take a look at it, but I'd like you to read that document. And I'd like to have a discussion with you about that. And reason being, I think it's critical because there are a lot of people out here who play that game. Oh, yes, we're standing against genocide. That's immoral. But we've got to stand against Putin and Russia and whatever with these same genocidal people. They're committing genocide, but somehow they're doing good things over here. I think there's a contradiction. I shared that with you, and I would like to have a discussion about that with you in the future if possible, Jody. I think, do you think that's an important conversation to have?
Yeah, we can do that. No problem.
Wonderful. All right, everyone. Thank you very much. Go to the communists with an S. .org. I would suspect that there is a communist.org in the same way that there's a great movie out, a great documentary called, I think it's Ukraine on Fire, which is really, really good to understand Ukraine. And then the imperialists went out and made a documentary called Ukraine Winter Fire, in which they try to confuse people. It's made by the same guy who made this other document called Cries from Syria, which is, of course, it is an imperialist attack on Syria. So they took this guy and they're like, oh no, Ukraine on fire. We'll make Ukraine winter fire. And then when you search, they switch them, right? In the same way. So that's why I'm suspicious of the communist without an S.org. I suspect it's the same kind of game being played. So go to thecommunist.org. Where else should people go to find all of your important information, Joti Brar?
You can follow me personally at, that's my name, Joti Brar. I have a Telegram channel. My party has a Telegram channel, The Communists. You can find us on YouTube at Proletarian TV. You'll find us pretty easily on Twitter and places like that. But as I said last time, I like Telegram the best, I think, in terms of being able to follow somebody's output. It's your best chance of actually getting a clue about what somebody's up to and what they think.
And YouTube, what is it, Proletarian TV?
Yes, Proletarian TV. So it's at Prol TV, or if you just search for Proletarian TV, you'll find us there.
If you're lucky, you'll find us there. If not, they'll like redirect you to CIA.org or something like that. All right, thanks a lot, everybody. Don't forget, share this on all your social media platforms, and make sure that you subscribe to this channel. Follow me on Rumble and Rockfin. Also, just in case they throw me off YouTube, then you'll still be able to find Jody and I doing our good work every Friday and all the other stuff that I do. Thank you very much. We are out.